will govern the country.
Good evening, Earth. This is Adam Sturch, broadcasting from the Mushroom Engine Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Space Mountain. Alright, I'm going to start off by peopling the roller coaster cars and and adjusting them. And then I've got a bunch of blue mixed up for the ocean, some yellow for the star, and some phthalo green for the lily pad, lotus pad thing. So, okay, so basically just blocking in color for the moment. Aside from putting folks on the roller coaster. Alright, so I'm going to raise this up just a little bit. Zoom in a little more. There we go. Alright, that'll do.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chomsky. You can hear me, right?
Yes, sir.
Sorry, Mr. Chomsky, for our technician. Can you say something again, please?
You want to check the sound?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So
okay, perfect. We can hear you.
Questions and discussion. Yeah.
Thank you very much again, Mr. Chomsky, for your very inspiring lecture and for your diagnosis of our global conditions. So I will start now with my questions and open then the floor to the audience. My first question is that you mentioned all these threats of our current situation, global situations, and we know that we are close to midnight, what you say. You mentioned the clock, and so my question is, our capitalist way of life, above all destruction, growth, imperative, it's a key problem of our system. We have the destructive economic system, the extreme pollution that destroys the planet, the biodiversity, the future generation, and above all, us, humankind. So how can we make this very unjust world that we human beings made, which is probably at the crossroads to a better one? What you would suggest for us, how we can get out of this amazing problems that we are facing?
Just think again of, say, one example that I mentioned, the major banks in the United States, and in fact elsewhere, where the chief executives understand perfectly well the effect of fossil fuel production, the dire effect, and are pouring money into increasing the flood of fossil fuels. And as I mentioned, they have two choices: to do what they're doing or to resign, in which case somebody else will do what they're doing. That is an institutional problem. It's a problem of the nature of the capitalist institutions. The duty, in fact, the legal responsibility of the CEO is to increase profits and market share. Well, what do you do about that? What you have to do is dismantle the institutions. But then we run into a problem of time scale. The time scale of dealing with the dire threat of environmental catastrophe and the time scale of dismantling institutions just don't match. It's a necessity to solve the problem within the framework of existing institutions, while at the same time proceeding to lay the basis for a much better world. And it's kind of interesting, and it can be done. There are serious, careful proposals. Maybe the most detailed one is by economist Robert Pollin, a leftist economist at the University of Massachusetts. Is a very detailed, sensible, highly worked out plan for how you could, with even contemporary technology, keep the global warming within some livable amount, if not 1.5 centigrade, maybe a little beyond, even within existing institutions. At the same time, it's also worth bearing in mind that the institutions are very fragile. In fact, if you look at debate going on in the United States right now, you can, and the same elsewhere, you can see how close we are to a radical transformation of institutions. So, for example, take a huge debate going on right now all over the world, prominently in the United States, all over the newspapers. How can we prevent China from stealing jobs from industrial workers? Well, it's interesting the way the debate is framed. Is it China that's stealing the jobs? I mean, is China putting a gun to the heads of General Motors and General Electric, Microsoft, IBM, and saying, you've got to send your jobs here? No, of course not. It's the management of those corporations that's deciding to do it. So what's the solution? To take which is not raised, but it's right at the edge of people's thinking, with a little push it can get there. Say, okay, since the problem is the management of the institutions, let's have a different kind of management. Maybe a more democratic form of management. And maybe the people in the enterprise should make the decision as to where investment should go. That happens to be an idea that was suggested by a rather obscure gentleman in the 19th century whose initials were KM, if anybody can remember. So yes, maybe we're right on the verge of saying, look, it's time for the people who work in the enterprise to make the decisions about what happens to it. And that's just on the cusp of a major radical transformation of institutions. I don't think that change of institutions is impossible. We should remember that if you go back to the early days of the Industrial Revolution, say in the United States, same in England earlier, working people, say about in the mid-19th century, the working people took it for granted that wage labor was an intolerable, illegitimate attack on their fundamental rights. That wage labor was essentially the same as slavery, except that it's temporary. Actually, that was a slogan of the Republican Party in the mid-19th century. It was upheld by Abraham Lincoln. It's a major principle of classical liberalism, going back to John Locke, Wilhelm von Humboldt, John Stuart Mill, and others. It's been suppressed, but I don't think it's far below the surface. Just as the question of decision-making over enterprises is not far below the surface. So to summarize, I think there are feasible measures to deal with the dire problem even within existing institutions that will take a lot of activism, mobilization, the work of the kind that Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise Movement, others have demonstrated recently. But at the same time, the radical change of institutions is not as remote a prospect as sometimes believe, sometimes claim that it's easier to think of the end of the world than of the end of capitalism. But I don't believe that. I think it's easy to think of it. And in fact, I think people are coming very close to the realization that they can do something about it.
So when I just summarize you the major radical transformation that we need, so the social and ecological transformation to secure our human being and Earth, so it is not possible. So you have a very, very pessimistic view that we cannot change the institutions because they are really oligarchical structured between political elites and economic elites. But on the other side, you are also an optimist because you are saying, okay, we have the social protest, we have the civil disobedience, we have the opportunity in our societies to go out to the streets, to go in front of parliaments and to try to have this radical change. But I just want to say that you have now, in your last sentence, you mentioned it, pessimistic view that we cannot change the parliamentary system and not also the parliamentary system. We know that big decisions are not made anymore in the parliament. So you said it, we have seen the multi-corporate World Bank, the ECB in Europe, and the financial markets. They are doing the decisions. So what you would answer now, if I understood you right, that you have a pessimistic view that we cannot change the institutions.
Well, I really don't believe that. In fact, let's think about it again. The major decisions are, of course, they're made by the World Bank and the IMF, but the driving force is the corporate world, the concentration of power in huge mega corporations. Now, and here what is needed is not so much civil disobedience as simple education. Simply think how close people are to realizing that, in fact, they have to take control. Go through it again. China's stealing our jobs. That's what's driven into people's heads every day. Obvious that China is not stealing our jobs. No, it's the corporations that decide to move to China that are stealing our jobs. Who tells them to move to China? The management. Suppose that the workforce of the enterprise democratically decides what should be done, not handing it over to the management. Suppose we then make a further move and eliminate the curse of wage labor and have democratic control. Is that a difficult argument? I think it's a pretty easy argument. I've just summarized it in a minute, It can easily be brought to people. It's never mentioned. Nobody says, look, the answer is not China, the problem of China. The answer is something was suggested by Karl Marx in the mid-19th century and of working people at the same time. That's the answer. But I don't think it takes a lot for people to get to understand that. It's never presented to them. You take a look at the entire discussion of job loss and the effects that it has, the pathologies that are being stimulated by people like Trump and others. It's simply that nobody is telling people, look, stop to think for a minute. If you think for a minute, you can figure this out. Doesn't even take a high school education. It's transparent. So along with militant action, which is very important, like Extinction Rebellion and so on, school strike, I think simple educational efforts can make an enormous difference in undermining highly repressive institutions, which are fundamentally illegitimate and should be dismantled, and there are ways to do it. Now, the time scales may not coincide exactly, but you can accelerate both of them. There are many opportunities for action. It's easy to be pessimistic, but I think we should remember the slogan that Gramsci made famous, pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will.
Thank you very much for this question. For this answer. So the education, you said, is a really important tool to change our society and also to change our economy. So our destroying economy that is destroying us and our planet. My next question is on the number that we have. The high number that we have now in the world, the highest number of refugees. So in the current world, the UN HCR is calling that we have 70 million people that are refugees. Others are speaking of 100 million people. At the same time, global social inequality and poverty are growing in many regions. You also mentioned it in your talk. And even in Western societies, we have increasing social divide that has deepened since the financial crisis a decade ago. So, isn't it the only consistent solution, Mr. Chomsky, to institutionalize global freedom of movement so that people can live their lives wherever they want?
It is, it's kind of like saying, in an era of wars and violence, the solution is peace on earth and goodwill to men. You know, that's true, but it doesn't get us very far. Now take, say, the Schengen Agreement, which did institute something like that within Europe. Very positive development, I think. But take a look at the consequences. In an era, it's, as you know, of course, under very severe attack everywhere. But not because it was a bad idea, because it is against the background of neoliberal austerity policies, which have severely harmed the lives of a large part of the population, leading them to search for scapegoats and being led by demagogues who drive them to scapegoats. So instead of blaming the policies, that the social and economic policies of the neoliberal era, the easiest thing is to blame immigrants. They're not responsible for it, but they're the victim. The easiest thing is to blame somebody more vulnerable than you. And the role of the demagogue is to drive that pathology. But the role of the activist is to undermine the pathology and to direct attention to what the real causes are. And if you address those causes, the objection to, say, the Schengen Agreement would dissolve. And it's more general. Pope Francis pointed out, I think quite accurately, that the crisis of refugees is not a refugee crisis, it's a moral crisis for the West. The idea that Europe is sending back tens of thousands of people, tens of thousands dying in the Mediterranean, bribing Turkey to keep them away from our shores, bribing Libya to just keep them there. You know. This is so shocking that can't even describe it. Same in the United States. I live not far from the southern border, Mexican border. The idea that miserable people are being separated from their children, who are put in concentration camps, put in solitary confinement, driven back to countries which are unlivable, is utterly shocking. And it becomes even more shocking when we realize that the hideous conditions from which people are fleeing did not just come as an act from God. Europe has a certain history of Africa, which I don't have to relate. The United States, even in recent years, has devastated Central America. People are fleeing right now from the Mayan highlands in Guatemala, where Ronald Reagan was supporting virtual genocide not long ago. Those countries were devastated by the United States. Now we punish the victims. All of this is a horrendous moral crisis, and it can be overcome, but first by understanding it and recognizing what it is. Not only should refugees be dealt with humanely, but we should also understand that they don't want to be refugees. Almost always they prefer to be in their own countries if that was possible, and that can be overcome. Instead of destroying their countries, we could be rebuilding them. If we were honest, we would call it reparations. If we're not that honest, we can call it aid or something. But all of that can be done. These are all policies well within range. Now we should bear in mind that what's called the refugee crisis today is nothing as compared with what's going to happen in another few decades. Simply calculate the consequences of a rise in sea level on, say, the low-lying plains of Bangladesh, and or the effect of a good bit of South Asia is now facing a water crisis already and almost unlivable heat during the summer. That's hundreds of millions of people. But what's going to happen to them if the West Antarctic ice sheets continue to melt or even accelerate? It doesn't take much imagination to figure it out. There'll be a refugee crisis of a kind that is absolutely unimaginable. And the solution is not dealing with refugees, but ending the crisis. Just as the solution in Europe is not tearing apart the Schengen Agreement, but undermining the social and economic policies that have allowed demagogic leaders to direct fear and anger at vulnerable people as scapegoats and away from the actual source of their distress.
Thank you for your answer. I will come to my third question. Even in our privileged societies, you mentioned before, neoliberal policies are leading more and more people into precariousness. So neoconservatism can be seen as the back of this neoliberal model. Women are the ones who suffer most in this current world, and care and reproduction work and cheap labor continue to be carried out by women. Violence against women continues also to be high in many parts of this world, including our Western societies. So in the last years we saw some important phenomena. So I will mention 5 million women in Spain went out for a successful general strike on March 8. Also in India, you have a lot of young female students last year protested for more self-determination rights, autonomy, against sexual violence, against patriarchy. So what do you think, Mr. Chomsky, about these new feminist movements?
Well, that's half of human society, which throughout most of history has been severely repressed, placed in a secondary position of subordination. It's a major stain on human history, not everywhere, but overwhelmingly, finally being addressed seriously. It's been a long struggle. Take today again, England and the United States, which were in many ways, the most advanced in freedom and democracy. In the United States, at the time of the American Revolution, the women were not recognized as people. They were property.
All right, picking this up with the second take. Coming up.
British law that basis.
Take two.
Women are property. The woman is the property of her father. Property is handed over to the husband. One of the arguments against allowing women to vote at the Constitutional Convention in the United States was that it would be unfair to unmarried men, because a married man would have 2 votes, his own and his properties. That remained in the law until 1975, literally. It was as a result of the activism of the 60s, including much of it led by women, the beginning of the women's movement, that finally the Supreme Court decided in 1975 that women have the rights of peers. They have the right to serve in federal juries. They're legally peers. Well, that's a formal advance, but it's been accompanied by many others. Now, there's a long way to go, but the things that you mentioned, which also take place in the Third World, huge women's march in Brazil, for example, which I discussed. Shortly before the election, there was a huge demonstrations in all cities of hundreds of thousands of people, led by women, against the terrible sexist gangster who was elected by this massive social media campaign. Mostly women, and these are very salutary, very positive developments. Again, there's a long way to go, plenty of problems, but it's the kind of thing that should gain enormous support and commitment.
So I will move now to my last question and then open the floor for the audience. My last question is, we have now these really, really big problems that we have after the world financial crisis of 2007, but also you mentioned in the 80s and 90s with Reagan and Thatcher, the neoliberal paradigm. There is no alternative, deregulation, dismantling of basic social rights, privatization, economization of our lives, of everything, of our soul, of our flesh. Capitalism is in us and everywhere. So these measures have been implemented to a large extent by centrist parties. So social democratic parties or conservative parties. So the mass centrist people's parties. Now they present themselves as good parties that oppose the new right-wing, ultra-nationalistic, authoritarian, regressive forces that you also mentioned are an international movement. We have Bolsonaro, Trump, Orban, Erdogan, the Brexiteers, a lot of people that are supporting these regressive forces. So for the plural left, and I know that you are coming from the left, from the libertarian socialist, anarcho-syndicalist movement, which itself has been now, for the plural left, all over the world in a crisis for decades. What can be a solution? So in Germany and also in France and in other parts in Europe, we are talking, should leftists focus on the state and should support left-wing populism? that should lead back to a socialist or social democratic Keynesian policies of the golden years? Or should we have to change the world in an international, transnational solidarity movement with many emancipatory forces can join against capitalism, oppression, and a nation state?
Well, I think
Yeah. So
all the options are not only worth pursuing, but are being pursued. So take the European Parliament elections. There is the beginnings of a transnational political movement within Europe. The Jonas Varoufakis's DiEM25 movement. It's beginning. It's facing major obstacles, many efforts to block it. Hasn't gotten to more than 7 or 8 countries by now. But Varoufakis and Bernie Sanders in the United States issued an important declaration calling for a progressive international to confront the reactionary international that's being forged by Steve Bannon and others, including all the lovely gentlemen you mentioned before. That can be done, but it's not just a matter of politics. As we've been discussing, this depends a lot, in fact, crucially, on the nature of the social and economic institutions. They're the ones that have to be changed. They're the foundation on the basis of which these things are happening. The center-left parties can now pretend to be the good guys as opposed to the far right, the neo-fascist right. But it's a very thin claim, since exactly as you pointed out, it's their neoliberal austerity policies that have led to the rise of the far right. Yes, when you have policies that devastate people, that create anger, resentment, bitterness, then you will get demagogues who will try to turn it to the far right. But it's the policies that the centrist parties have been pursuing that is leading to this. And they're the ones who have to look in the mirror and say, look what we've been doing wrong, and much more important than that, the populations themselves have to come to understand why these things are happening, how much we can take control of ourselves if we choose to, up to the level of taking control of enterprises on the part of their own workforce, the most democratic possible answer. All of these things are possible. It takes work, takes effort, plenty of barriers, but there have been harder problems in the past. I mean, I'm old enough to remember vividly the dark clouds of fascism spreading over Europe in the 1930s. Actually, if I can have a moment for an anecdote, the first article I wrote was in February 1939, after the fall of Barcelona. It was in an elementary school newspaper. I'm sure not a very great article, but I remember the way it started. Started by saying that Austria falls, the Anschluss, Czechoslovakia falls, the Munich, Toledo falls, major city in Spain. Now Barcelona falls. Fascism has spread over Spain, seems to be inexorable, spreading over all Europe. It's obvious what it meant. I'm not to repeat that. Now those were days of a darkness that far exceeds what we're facing today. And it's not the only time in history when monstrous crimes had to be faced. Slavery, many others. It's been done, can be done again.
Mr. Chosky, for being here. Well, I've been in the first event and now in the last, and I think I have now a pretty clear idea of the problems, the injustices, and the challenges we have now in this world. But what I've been missing is concrete solutions about what we should do about it. You've been proposing some ideas, but on the institutional level, my question for you is, what can I do as an individual, as a student, do today? Should I go on the streets and protest more? Should I go reading more books and studying? Or another thing? Thanks.
I think it's very straightforward. There's no magic key. We all know the answers. One thing that a young person can do is exactly what many young people are doing. In fact, it's kind of striking that in the lead of protest and concern, arousing concern for environmental catastrophe, in the lead are young people, students in schools, the school strike, Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise Movement, Earth Strike, which I didn't mention, others. Those are some of the things that can be done. But there's much more than that. People's understanding has to be changed. Consciousness has to be changed. What's called hegemonic common sense has to be undermined. That takes individual effort. It can start with things as simple as talking to your neighbors. Let's take, say, real movements. How do they get started? Take, say, civil rights movement in the United States. Had major effects. Not enough, but major effects. How did it start? Well, in 1960, a few students, black students, 4 black students, decided to sit in at a lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, where blacks were not allowed to sit. They were immediately arrested and taken away. That could have ended it, but the next day some more black students came and sat there. Pretty soon some white students joined them. Within a couple of months you had freedom riders going through the South, very dangerous incidentally. Many were killed trying to encourage poor black farmers to vote, something as simple as that. Well, ended up being huge demonstrations, massive demonstration in Washington. Finally, significant legislations were passed. Take the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. Vietnam War was the worst crime in the post-war period. It took a long time to get any objection to it. I can remember myself back in the early 60s when the war was being sharply escalated and nothing was being said about it. I was actually giving talks in the living rooms of neighbors or in a church with 4 people there. A lot of other people were doing it too. And pretty soon it grew, and you had massive anti-war movement so strong that it prevented, we know from the Pentagon papers, it prevented the U.S. government from sending more troops there in 1968. It blocked a likely, possibly even use of nuclear weapons. Now that's the way movements develop and grow. What can young people do? Exactly what they've done in the past. That these movements started. It was the same with the feminist movement. It's been the same with any popular movement throughout history. So what can you do? Answer is just about anything. People like you are really quite privileged. Otherwise you wouldn't be here. I mean, you have lots of opportunities. It's never going to be easy. You know, it might be something as simple as talking to a few people in the neighbor's living room, the way the anti-war movement got started. It might be something as simple as sitting in on a lunch counter might be something much bigger, like the Extinction Rebellion or school strikes. But it's all available. And the problems, when you think about the scale of the problems, they look so overwhelming that you just give up. But when you think of how fragile these systems are, and they are fragile, as soon as you begin cutting away at their roots, they begin to erode and collapse. And small efforts can easily be grow into major developments.
We've been talking about the ecological threat as one of the big three threats, and I wanted to ask if you think that at this point it is necessary to take political measures to restrict population growth in order to facilitate a good future for the planet, or if we can even take this step, if it's ethically possible to take this step.
Well, the problem in, say, Germany is not restricting population growth. Population is declining. And there's a reason. It's been this. Population growth is one of the major problems of the world for which we know a solution. Education of women. It's been demonstrated over and over in rich countries and poor countries that education of women leads very quickly to decline in fertility. So it's the reason why in advanced countries, Japan, Europe, population is actually declining. And the same is true in poor areas. India, for example, there's huge population growth with one exception, the state of Kerala, which was under communist leadership most of its independence history. It's a very poor area, but it has very high educational levels. If you travel through India, which I've done, it's the one place where you see people sitting in front of a restaurant reading newspapers. Literacy is very high.
All right, that's starting to get kind of fun.
The women's education is high.
I like the figures
And that
in the
has
box
led to
cars,
a sharp decline
and
in fertility.
the rest of it's starting to come together as
It's
well.
not the kind of thing you have to do with a gun, as people said.
Decent color
It's a simple solution.
blocking
And
there.
it happened,
All right.
and it should continue.
Okay.
And yes, population should be controlled. Fortunately, there's a very humane way to do it, a way which should be pursued quite independently of the question of fertility, namely bringing women into the functioning society, including
Cool.
basic education.
So that gets this another step in the right direction. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Space Mountain. Have a good night, Earth.